In the heart of the city, nestled among towering glass buildings and upscale boutiques, there stood a small yet renowned art gallery known as the Golden Frame. The gallery had been a fixture in the art world for decades, a place where collectors, artists, and critics alike gathered to admire the works of some of the most celebrated creators in history. Its owner, Adrian Marx, was a well-known figure in the art world. Tall, with silver hair, sharp features, and a penchant for wearing expensive tailored suits, Adrian's presence was commanding. His reputation as a tastemaker and connoisseur was unmatched, and his opinion on art was sought after by everyone who mattered in the industry. Adrian's sharp eye for valuable art had made him a successful man, a powerful figure in the world of fine art. He knew how to read a piece at a glance, its texture, its color, its meaning. But beyond his vast knowledge, there was something else about him that kept him at the top: arrogance. He had built his empire by dismissing the artists he deemed unworthy, and he had no problem doing the same to those whose work didn't fit into his idealized vision of art. That evening, the Golden Frame hosted a gala event to showcase a new collection. It was an exclusive affair, and Adrian had invited some of the city's wealthiest patrons, eager to impress them with the newest masterpieces he had secured for the gallery. The night was alive with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of glasses, as the guests moved from painting to sculpture, admiring each piece in turn. Adrian watched from his corner, sipping his scotch, as the crowd marveled at his curated collection. He was in his element, his confidence radiating through the room. But it was in the midst of this luxurious evening that the incident that would forever alter his life took place. A young man stood by the door, nervously clutching a portfolio of his artwork. He had been invited to the event by a mutual acquaintance, a friend who believed in his work, despite the lack of recognition. His name was Malik Carter, a black artist from a modest background who had spent years honing his craft in obscurity. His paintings were full of raw emotion, capturing the struggles, beauty, and resilience of life in vivid colors. His style was unlike anything Adrian had ever seen before, but there was a reason for that. It wasn't the kind of art that appealed to the mainstream, or so Adrian thought. Malik had come to the Golden Frame with a sense of hope, although he knew deep down that this gallery wasn't one that typically welcomed someone like him. His art was unrefined in some ways, chaotic and bold in others, but it had heart. It spoke to those who were willing to see beyond the surface and understand the struggles behind the brushstrokes. He had brought his portfolio to show Adrian Marx, hoping to gain the recognition his work deserved. As Malik nervously approached Adrian, the gallery owner's sharp eyes noticed him immediately. Adrian didn't recognize him and, for a moment, thought he was just another guest who had wandered in. But as Malik reached out to introduce himself, Adrian raised an eyebrow and glanced over his shoulder to check on the more important guests. He didn't have time for someone like this. "Can I help you?" Adrian asked, his voice tinged with a condescending tone. "I'm Malik Carter. I brought some of my work to show you. I'm hoping you might be interested in featuring my art at the gallery," Malik said, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. Adrian took a long sip of his drink before eyeing Malik's portfolio with disdain. "You're an artist?" he asked, his lips curling into a slight sneer. "I didn't realize the gallery was accepting submissions from, well, people like you." Malik's heart skipped a beat, but he refused to let his face betray his emotions. He knew that Adrian Marx was not an easy man to impress, but he had hoped that his work would speak for itself. Ignoring Malik's hurt expression, Adrian took the portfolio with a flourish. He flipped through the pages, each one displaying vibrant, intense paintings of urban life, of joy, pain, and the struggles of black identity. But Adrian's eyes quickly narrowed with each piece he examined. To him, these paintings weren't anything special. They were too loud, too messy, too raw. They didn't fit into the sophisticated world of art that he had cultivated for so long. Adrian muttered under his breath as he finished flipping through the last page. "Well, you certainly have enthusiasm. But I'm afraid this kind of work doesn't belong here." He handed the portfolio back to Malik without making eye contact. Malik's chest tightened as he took back his portfolio, the weight of Adrian's dismissive tone sinking deep into his bones. I believe in my work, Malik said quietly, trying to muster some courage. And I think others will, too. Adrian chuckled, the sound sharp and almost mocking. Others might be interested, yes. But not people with taste. Not people who understand art. He raised a hand dismissively, as if trying to shoo a fly away. If you want to make a name for yourself, you should try a different approach. Perhaps a more traditional one. This? He gestured to the paintings. This is just noise. The word stung, and Malik could feel the weight of every insult hanging in the air. He had expected some resistance, but nothing like this. He had poured his soul into each brushstroke, each painting, and to have it so casually dismissed was an unbearable blow. But still, he remained silent, biting back the urge to lash out. Adrian, noticing that Malik had yet to leave, sighed impatiently. Listen, young man, he said, his tone now tinged with boredom. Art is a business. It's about knowing what people want to see. Not what you think they should see. If you want to make a living, you'll need to adjust your approach. Maybe even consider changing your style. He paused, as if waiting for Malik to agree. That's the way it works. Malik stood there for a long moment, trying to keep his composure. He had come hoping for an opportunity, but instead, he had been humiliated. He could feel the eyes of the gallery's patrons on him now, some of them smirking, some simply watching with mild curiosity. He knew that Adrian's words carried weight, that the gallery owner's opinion could make or break an artist's career. And yet, in that moment, Malik made a decision that would shape the future of the art world. With a quiet nod, Malik turned and walked away, but not before he gave one last glance at Adrian. A small, determined fire burned in his chest. Adrian Marks had underestimated him, and Malik knew that was a mistake. Why you should never anger humans. Adrian may have dismissed him as unworthy, but what he didn't know was that Malik's art had already touched the lives of many. What he didn't know was that the world was about to change, not through art galleries, not through people like him, but through people like Malik Carter, who refused to stay silent. And one day, Adrian would learn just how wrong he was. As Malik walked away from the golden frame, a simmering anger began to build within him. His mind raced, and though he wanted to shout, to yell at Adrian Marks for his condescension, he knew that would be a waste. The gallery owner had already made up his mind. He had dismissed Malik based on his assumptions, the fact that the artist didn't look the part or fit the mold. But there was something Adrian didn't know, something that, if he'd taken the time to truly look at Malik's work, would have made him rethink everything. Malik's art wasn't just an expression of anger or frustration, it was the product of years of hardship, sacrifice, and quiet perseverance. It had taken years for him to build a reputation, even if it wasn't known in the circles Adrian frequented. Malik had learned to work outside the boundaries set by the traditional art world, carving his own path through underground exhibitions, secret auctions, and online galleries. He had no need for the approval of someone like Adrian Marks. The truth was, Malik's work was already worth millions, but he had kept it hidden. For now. Back at his modest studio apartment, surrounded by his paintings and sketches, Malik sat quietly for a while, reflecting on his journey. Growing up in a rough neighborhood had taught him more than any art school could. He had learned the importance of self-reliance, how to find beauty in the harshest of places, and how to make art out of pain. His canvases told stories that few understood, stories of resilience, of a community fighting to thrive, of a man pushing against the weight of expectations. But there was more. Malik had been secretly selling his work for years, using anonymous online auctions and private buyers who appreciated his style. He had connected with wealthy collectors who didn't care about the prestige of gallery names, but who recognized the intrinsic value of true art. Slowly, over time, his collection had grown into something powerful, something that could change the art world forever. Malik had a small fortune at his disposal, and he had used it wisely, investing in new talent, acquiring older, forgotten masterpieces, and positioning himself as someone to be reckoned with. He had never wanted fame. He had never sought the spotlight or the recognition of people like Adrian Marx. His motivation was always the same: to make art for the sake of art, to express something deep within himself, to give voice to those whose stories had never been told. But now, after his encounter with Adrian, Malik realized he had a new purpose: to prove a point. To show the art world that it didn't belong solely to the powerful and the privileged. That it didn't belong to people like Adrian Marx, who could dismiss someone based on the color of their skin or the way they spoke. As the days passed, Malik started plotting his next move. The world of art was a game, and Adrian Marx had just made the mistake of underestimating him. But Malik wasn't just going to take his revenge. He wasn't that kind of man. What he wanted was something far more satisfying. He wanted to change the rules of the game entirely. His first step was to contact some of his wealthiest buyers. He knew that, in the world of high-end art, connections were everything. He had built a network of influential people over the years, people who shared his passion for art but who were not bound by the traditional structures of galleries or museums. They appreciated the value of a piece for what it truly was, not just for who had curated it or how much the gallery owner said it was worth. He had already begun buying up works from lesser-known artists who, like him, had been overlooked by the mainstream art world. Some of them were just starting their careers, while others were already established but had been forgotten in the chaos of contemporary art trends. Malik was selective, always looking for the raw, unpolished talent that had been ignored. His purchases were quiet, discreet. They didn't make headlines, but they were adding up. Malik didn't care about the price tags. The money was just a tool to him, a way to acquire what he wanted. He wasn't in it for the status or the recognition. What he sought was influence, the kind of quiet power that could alter the course of the art world without anyone realizing it was happening. He didn't need to walk into galleries or flaunt his wealth. He didn't need Adrian Marx's approval. What he had was far more important: he had an understanding of the art world that people like Adrian would never have. There was another part of Malik's plan that was more personal. He had spent years perfecting his craft, his style. He knew his work had a voice, something deeper than the flashy, superficial art that was often celebrated. His paintings were not meant to be understood immediately. They were meant to challenge, to provoke, to ask questions. Adrian had missed all of that. He had failed to see the depth, the passion, the uniqueness that defined Malik's work. The artist was determined to make Adrian see it, on his own terms. One afternoon, as Malik walked through his small studio, he stopped in front of one of his most prized pieces, a large, abstract painting of a figure standing tall amidst a swirling storm of colors, the background a blend of bold reds and deep blues. It was a piece he had poured his soul into, capturing the spirit of resilience that he had grown up with. He had sold several smaller works over the years, but this one was different. It was his masterpiece, and it was going to change everything. He decided that this painting, along with a few others, would be the ones to bring Adrian Marx to his knees. In the coming weeks, Malik began quietly selling off parts of his collection, strategically investing in other artists and acquiring works that would elevate his reputation. But he also began preparing for something bigger. Something that would show Adrian, and the entire art world, just how wrong they were. Malik was playing a long game. He wasn't angry, not in the traditional sense. He wasn't out to destroy anyone. But he would show them that the human spirit, the true power of art, couldn't be contained by the narrow views of men like Adrian Marx. In doing so, he would prove that underestimating humans, especially those who had been overlooked, was a mistake no one could afford to make. As Malik's influence grew, the art world would slowly begin to take notice. And when the time came, Adrian Marx would be forced to reckon with the fact that the very artist he had mocked was now a force to be reckoned with. The night of the gala at the Golden Frame had left an indelible mark on Malik. Adrian Marx had no idea that by dismissing him, he had set in motion a series of events that would come back to haunt him. But Malik had always been patient, one of the qualities that had helped him succeed. He had never been the type to react impulsively, especially not when it came to something as important as his art and his career. Instead, he would wait for the right moment, bide his time, and then strike when it mattered most. Over the following weeks, Malik became more deliberate in his actions. He continued to work quietly in his studio, creating new pieces while monitoring the art world from behind the scenes. His network of buyers, collectors, and fellow artists had grown stronger. Some of the wealthiest patrons of the art world, those who had long since grown disillusioned with the corporate side of the business, began to take notice of his work. They admired his raw emotion, his unfiltered voice, and the way he captured the essence of human struggle. Malik's pieces had something that the polished, mass-produced works of other artists didn't have: a soul. Adrian Marx, however, was oblivious to the growing storm brewing around him. He continued to curate his gallery with the same arrogance and condescension that had made him rich. He was still busy acquiring pieces from artists he deemed worthy, and his ego remained as inflated as ever. His reputation among the elite of the art world remained unchallenged, and his dominance in the market was unquestioned. That was until the unexpected happened. It started with a quiet transaction. Malik had purchased a series of works from an artist who had been previously overlooked, a woman named Sofia Rivera. Sofia's paintings were bold and unorthodox, challenging traditional notions of beauty, but they weren't what the mainstream buyers were looking for. The art world had dismissed her, much like they had Malik. But Malik saw potential in Sofia's work, and he saw a way to elevate both her and himself at the same time. Within a week, Sophia's work was being showcased at private exhibitions attended by some of the most influential art collectors in the world, and Malik was making waves. The price tags on her pieces soared, and soon enough, Sophia's name became one that people were starting to whisper about. The art world had a new star, and Malik Carter, the unknown artist, had played a crucial role in her rise. Adrian Marx, of course, had no interest in these new, unconventional artists. His tastes were entrenched in the classic, the refined, the works that catered to the tastes of the rich elite. He had never cared for Sophia's style, nor did he care for the emerging talents that Malik was quietly championing. He was too busy putting together his own exhibitions, selecting pieces that fit within his established vision of what art should be. But what Adrian didn't know was that while he had been busy curating for the same old crowd, the world was beginning to shift. Malik and his network of buyers were slowly starting to disrupt the status quo. Then came the moment that would prove to be the turning point. A renowned art auction house, one that had long been dominated by figures like Adrian Marx, was preparing for one of its largest sales in years. The event was to feature some of the most valuable works in the world, and Adrian had already positioned himself as one of the key players in the auction. His presence at the event was expected to raise the stakes and generate significant buzz. But what Adrian didn't realize was that Malik was about to enter the game, and he wasn't playing by the same rules. Malik's acquisition of works from artists like Sofia Rivera was part of a larger strategy. He wasn't just buying art, he was building an empire. He had amassed a collection of rare, powerful, and influential pieces, many of which had been overlooked by the mainstream art world. These were the works that would shift the balance of power in the industry. And the auction was the perfect venue to make his move. The evening of the auction arrived, and the air in the venue was thick with anticipation. Wealthy collectors, art critics, and gallery owners from around the world gathered to bid on pieces that were expected to fetch millions. Adrian Marx was present, of course, as was his usual group of patrons. He had been tipped off about a few of the pieces he thought were undervalued and was confident that his reputation alone would allow him to secure them at a price far below their worth. But when the bidding for a painting by Sofia Rivera began, Adrian was caught off guard. He had heard the whispers about her work, but he had never imagined that one of her pieces would appear at such a high-profile event. It was an abstract painting, full of raw energy, an exploration of color and emotion that spoke to something deep within the viewer. It wasn't the kind of piece Adrian would normally look at twice, but he had underestimated its value, and, more importantly, its potential. The bidding started low, but soon, as more buyers became aware of the painting, the price began to climb. What started as a quiet transaction quickly became a battle for ownership. Malik was there, watching from the sidelines, his hand steady as he made his bid. He wasn't going to let this one slip through his fingers. The price soared higher and higher, and to Adrian's surprise, Malik was the one who emerged victorious, outbidding everyone else in the room. Adrian watched in disbelief as Malik's name was called. He had never considered the possibility that someone like Malik, someone so unassuming, so beneath his notice, could have the power to drive the price of a piece like that so high. Malik had just made a statement, and Adrian had missed it entirely. But that was only the beginning. Over the next few months, Malik's presence in the art world began to grow. He continued to acquire pieces from both up-and-coming artists and established names who had been pushed aside by the mainstream. Each piece he bought was another strategic move in his larger plan to disrupt the art market. Malik was no longer an outsider, he was a force to be reckoned with. The very industry that had ignored him, mocked him, and underestimated him was now starting to pay attention. Adrian Marx, meanwhile, continued to focus on his own collection, but the shift in the market was becoming undeniable. His usual clients were beginning to take note of the rising stars Malik had championed. The whispers were growing louder, and the old guard was beginning to realize that they were being left behind. Malik wasn't just buying art, he was reshaping the art world, slowly and surely. And with every piece he acquired, every artist he helped elevate, he was proving one very important point: never underestimate the power of a human who has been overlooked. As the months passed, Malik Carter's name continued to gain traction in the art world. While Adrian Marx remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface, Malik's quiet revolution was gaining momentum. With every auction, with every new piece he acquired, he was positioning himself as a buyer that no one could ignore. He was no longer an outsider trying to get a foot in the door, he was a player, a collector with influence and vision. Adrian Marx, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the subtle shift in the art world but couldn't quite put his finger on it. The exhibitions he curated no longer had the same level of prestige, and whispers of new, disruptive forces were circulating among the wealthiest art patrons. At first, Adrian thought it was just a passing trend, another fad that would fade away like the many others before it. But as time went on, he realized that this wasn't just a trend. Malik Carter had created something that couldn't be undone. The tipping point came when the Golden Frame decided to host one of its most ambitious exhibitions yet, a new era in art. The show was meant to showcase a collection of works from the most influential artists of the moment, those who had been deemed revolutionary, pushing the boundaries of modern art. Adrian was determined that this would be the event that re-established his dominance in the industry. He was carefully curating each piece, handpicking what he believed were the most cutting-edge works, ensuring that the gallery would be seen as the place to be for art collectors and critics alike. But Malik had a different idea. Over the past few months, Malik had been steadily acquiring works that had previously been dismissed by the art world. He had started buying pieces from artists who had been forgotten by galleries like the Golden Frame, artists whose works were now worth a fortune because their value had been overlooked for so long. His collection had expanded exponentially, and Malik was no longer just a collector. He was an investor in art history, curating a collection that would change the narrative of contemporary art forever. Malik knew that the new era in art exhibition would be a pivotal moment. He had been planning for this, waiting for the right opportunity to strike. If Adrian Marx wanted to showcase the next wave of art, Malik would be there to ensure that his name, his influence, and his vision would be seen as the true future of the industry. On the day of the exhibition, the atmosphere inside the Golden Frame was electric. Art collectors, critics, and celebrities milled around, eager to catch a glimpse of the next big thing. The walls were adorned with the works that Adrian had personally selected, paintings that adhered to the expectations of the elite, each one more polished and refined than the last. The crowd seemed to approve of his choices, nodding and murmuring in approval as they moved from piece to piece. Then, at the height of the evening, Malik arrived. Dressed simply but confidently, Malik walked into the gallery with the quiet assurance of a man who knew his worth. His presence was immediate, his reputation preceding him. The moment he stepped through the doors, the room fell silent. Eyes turned to him, whispers began, and soon enough, the crowd had gathered around him, curious and expectant. Adrian, standing at the far end of the gallery, watched Malik approach, his heart sinking as he realized that something was wrong. Malik wasn't just a spectator tonight, he was the show. He had come to disrupt, to show that art wasn't just about the approval of the old guard, the established names who thought they controlled the market. He had come to prove that the future of art belonged to those who had been underestimated, to those who had been ignored, to the artists and collectors who had been pushed aside by the likes of Adrian Marx. As the evening wore on, Malik took a quiet stroll through the exhibition. He glanced at each piece on the wall, his eyes scanning the work of the artists Adrian had deemed worthy of this event. Some of the works were impressive, others not so much, but Malik didn't care about the pieces themselves. He was there for one thing only, to make a statement. Without warning, Malik pulled out his phone and sent a message to one of his closest allies in the art world, an auction house executive who had long been involved in selling his pieces anonymously. It was a simple instruction: list my collection. List it now. Within minutes, the art world began to take notice. Auction catalogs were sent out to private buyers, and word spread like wildfire that Malik Carter's personal collection of rare and valuable art was going up for sale. The pieces were not just valuable for their artistic merit, they were valuable because they represented the true pulse of contemporary art, the unrefined, the chaotic, the bold works that had been ignored by the mainstream. Adrian Marx watched in disbelief as the evening took a sharp turn. The whispers grew louder as more and more guests pulled out their phones, checking for the latest news about Malik's auction. Collectors were already bidding on his pieces, before the official listings had even been made public. The prices were climbing rapidly, and in that moment, it became clear that Malik had far more influence than Adrian had ever anticipated. The art world was shifting, and Adrian Marx was being left behind. The final blow came when one of Adrian's patrons, an influential art collector named Simon Caldwell, approached him with a grave expression. "Adrian," Simon said quietly, "I just put in a bid on one of Malik Carter's pieces. I'm afraid I can't ignore this new direction anymore. I've got to follow the trend." Adrian's face flushed with anger. "What do you mean, follow the trend?" he demanded. "This is just a passing phase. It won't last. Malik's work is nothing but a flash in the pan." But Simon, the man who had once bought from Adrian's gallery without hesitation, was already walking away, his mind made up. The writing was on the wall, and the art world was turning its back on the old guard. Malik's quiet revolution had begun, and Adrian Marx, for all his wealth and influence, was now just another figure in the past. For Malik, this was only the beginning. The true battle was about to begin. He wasn't just going to change the art world's narrative, he was going to take control of it. And Adrian Marx would learn the hardest lesson of all: never underestimate humans, especially the ones you've mocked and ignored. As the weeks passed, Malik's auction went live, and the art world trembled. Each piece he had quietly acquired and displayed at private exhibitions was now being sold at unimaginable prices. Buyers from around the world scrambled to place bids, and the market began to shift in ways that Adrian Marx couldn't ignore. The pieces Malik had chosen for his collection weren't just valuable for their artistic merit, they embodied the rebellious spirit that had been long absent from the mainstream art world. His work was provocative, raw, and emotional. It was a direct challenge to the polished, soulless art that had ruled the elite galleries for decades. By now, Adrian Marx had come to a bitter realization: he had been eclipsed. Not just by Malik's influence, but by the very artists and patrons he had once dismissed. The names Malik had elevated, the works he had championed, were now the subjects of bidding wars, selling for amounts that Adrian couldn't even fathom. His gallery, the Golden Frame, had begun to see fewer visitors, fewer serious buyers, and fewer collectors interested in the pieces he was offering. The spotlight had shifted, and it was no longer shining on Adrian Marx. But Adrian wasn't ready to give up. He couldn't accept the fact that someone like Malik, an artist he had once so easily dismissed, was now running circles around him. He began to reach out to the most influential names in the art world, trying to arrange deals, to buy up the works that were being overshadowed by Malik's meteoric rise. But there was a problem. The collectors who once bought from him were no longer interested in the same kinds of pieces. They had turned their attention to Malik's auction, and Adrian Marks was being left behind. Still, he couldn't accept his loss of power. He decided to confront Malik directly, to take back control of the narrative. It was time to play the game his way. The two men finally crossed paths again at an exclusive event held by one of the most prestigious art collectors, Fiona Reynolds. It was an event where only the most powerful figures in the art world could attend, a place where deals were made behind closed doors, and art was bought not just for its value, but for the social capital it provided. Fiona had invited both Adrian and Malik, though the tension between the two was palpable. Everyone knew the two men were on opposite sides of a growing divide. As Adrian walked into the opulent ballroom, he immediately spotted Malik across the room. The artist was standing alone, talking to a small group of up-and-coming art curators. He looked at ease, his presence commanding attention without effort. The way he carried himself was that of someone who had already won. Adrian felt the sting of jealousy, the frustration of having been outmaneuvered. With a deep breath, Adrian made his way over to Malik, determined to have it out with him once and for all. "Malik," Adrian said coolly, extending his hand with a forced smile, "I see you've managed to make quite the name for yourself. I must say, I never expected it to go this far. You've certainly stirred things up in the art world, haven't you?" Malik looked up from his conversation and smiled, a smile that was both knowing and respectful. "I've been creating art, Adrian. It's what I've always done. You just didn't recognize it when you had the chance." Adrian's smile faltered for a moment. "Let's not pretend that this is all about art, Malik. You've manipulated the market, driven up prices, with your so-called rebellious pieces. You've turned the art world into a playground for the rich and famous. It's a game, and you're playing it well. But remember this, it's all about who you know, not just what you create." Malik's smile never wavered. "You're right, Adrian. It's always about who you know. But I've learned something that you didn't understand. It's not about the name on the gallery door, or the status you hold in this industry. It's about staying true to the work. And when you've earned the respect of the right people, when you've created something real, then you're in a position to change the game." Adrian scoffed. "You think you've changed the game? You're just a flash in the pan, Malik. The art world will move on to the next thing, just like it always does. Your moment will pass, and I'll be here, picking up the pieces." Malik raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not playing for the moment, Adrian. I'm playing for the future. And I'm not waiting for the art world to move on to the next trend. I'm shaping it. You'll see soon enough, when the old ways are swept away and the new world takes root. I'll be here, and so will my artists." Adrian's eyes narrowed. He could feel his frustration rising, but he knew there was no point in arguing with Malik. The artist had made his mark, and no amount of words could change that. The power was shifting, and Adrian had no idea how to stop it. Malik's words, though simple, were cutting. The old guard was fading, and the future was being written by those who had been overlooked, those who had been underestimated. The power structure that Adrian had spent his entire career building was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the evening wore on, Malik's influence only grew. Conversations around him shifted, and the new narrative was being written by people who believed in the authenticity of his work. Fiona Reynolds, who had invited both men to the event, soon made a quiet move to buy several of Malik's pieces for her private collection. She saw the potential in Malik's vision, in the direction he was taking the art world. Adrian, meanwhile, found himself becoming more and more isolated, unable to reconcile the changing tides. The next day, a breaking news story spread through the art world. Malik Carter's latest auction had surpassed even the most extravagant predictions, with his pieces selling for record-breaking sums. Experts were now calling him the next great visionary of the modern era. Adrian Marks was nowhere to be found in the news cycle. His influence had waned, and the collectors who had once filled his gallery were now buying from Malik. The art world had shifted, and Adrian, for the first time, was forced to watch from the sidelines. Malik, on the other hand, was only getting started. His quiet revolution had become a full-blown movement, and as the buyers, artists, and critics aligned behind him, the rules of the game began to change for good. In the end, Malik didn't just defeat Adrian Marx, he dismantled the old guard, one piece of art at a time. The art world had irrevocably shifted, and Adrian Marx, once a towering figure within the industry, was left to watch the rise of Malik Carter from the sidelines. Malik's calculated rise from humble artist to powerhouse buyer had thrown the art world into chaos, and its established players were scrambling to adapt to the new reality. Adrian had never thought he would see the day when he would be overshadowed by someone he had so easily dismissed. But that day had arrived, and the storm Malik had quietly started was now fully underway. While Adrian's name was being erased from conversations, Malik was not only becoming an art world phenomenon but also a trendsetter who redefined what it meant to be an art collector. His unorthodox methods, choosing to elevate unconventional artists and invest in pieces others considered undervalued, had struck a chord with the new generation of buyers, those who were tired of the pomp and pretension of the old guard. They were drawn to Malik's authenticity, his boldness, and his ability to see what others could not. Malik was no longer just a collector, he was a disruptor. But Malik's success did not come without its complications. His every move was now being scrutinized by the art community. Journalists who had once ignored him now hung on his every word, writing articles about his next acquisitions, his next big move. His auctions were headlined in every major newspaper, and art critics who had once dismissed his style were now trying to decode his every gesture, analyzing his decisions for hidden meanings. It wasn't just the press that was watching closely, Adrian Marx had his eyes set firmly on Malik, and he was determined not to let the upstart artist continue to rewrite the rules of the game. He was a proud man, and there was nothing he hated more than losing control. His gallery, once a symbol of power, now seemed like a relic of a bygone era. The wealthy clients who once sought out Adrian for advice on which art to buy were now seeking out Malik instead. The balance of power in the art world was tipping, and Adrian Marx was powerless to stop it. But Adrian wasn't one to go down quietly. He had spent decades building his reputation, and he wasn't about to let someone like Malik Carter come along and tear it all down. Determined to regain control, Adrian devised a plan to fight back. If he couldn't outbid Malik in the traditional way, then he would have to find another route, one that could outsmart the system Malik had built. Adrian began making private deals with some of the most influential collectors in the world, trying to pool resources to fight Malik at his own game. He knew that the wealthiest patrons were still interested in high-end art, they were just being drawn to the wrong people. But if Adrian could buy up enough of Malik's prized pieces, he could drain the value of Malik's collection, render it useless, and restore his place at the top. It was a risky strategy, one that could either secure Adrian's comeback or further cement Malik's position as the kingmaker of the art world. Malik, however, was not blind to the threat Adrian posed. Over the past several months, he had been keeping a close eye on Adrian's movements. He knew that the battle for control of the art market was far from over. But Malik had one thing that Adrian didn't, the trust of the new generation of collectors. While Adrian's strategy relied on old-world alliances and backroom deals, Malik's power was rooted in a completely new model. He had built a community of like-minded collectors who were passionate about art for the right reasons, not for investment, not for status, but for the raw, transformative power of creativity. Malik understood the value of his work not only in monetary terms but also in cultural terms. The art he had championed wasn't just a commodity, it was an expression of freedom, of individuality, of defiance against the conventional norms. It resonated with people who were seeking authenticity in a world that had grown tired of superficial displays of wealth and power. His auctions weren't just a chance to buy art, they were events that allowed people to align themselves with something greater than the status quo. For Malik, it was about creating a movement, not just an empire. The true test of this battle would come at an exclusive auction event that was slated to take place in the fall. It was a high-profile event that would feature some of the most sought-after pieces in the world, and both Adrian and Malik had been invited to attend. While Adrian was focused on dismantling Malik's influence, Malik was preparing to take the next step in his plan to reshape the industry. He had a strategy that would take his revolution to the next level, and it would be his most daring move yet. As the day of the auction drew near, the tension between the two men reached a boiling point. Adrian, growing increasingly desperate, continued to make his moves behind the scenes. He had secured some of the rarest works of art from his connections, pieces that he was confident would fetch astronomical prices. His goal was simple: to reclaim the spotlight, to prove that he could still dominate the market. Malik, on the other hand, was focused on something entirely different. He had been working with his network of artists to curate a collection that would be unlike anything the auction world had ever seen. These pieces were not just valuable, they were statements, reflections of the time, expressions of the current cultural zeitgeist. Malik had managed to secure works from artists that were still flying under the radar, whose creations were raw, emotional, and political. These pieces would not just sell for a high price, they would demand attention. On the night of the auction, the venue was filled with the usual crowd of wealthy buyers and art enthusiasts. But this time, there was something different in the air. There was a palpable sense of anticipation, a tension that hung over the room as if everyone knew that something monumental was about to happen. As Adrian made his way to the front of the room, he saw Malik standing with a small group of curators and collectors. His calm demeanor was the complete opposite of Adrian's tense posture, but there was no mistaking the determination in Malik's eyes. The auction began, and the bidding started as expected, with Adrian securing several of the high-profile pieces he had his eye on. But as Malik's collection came up for bidding, something shifted. The room fell silent as the first piece, a striking portrait of a figure breaking free from chains, was placed under the gavel. The bidding started low, but it didn't stay that way for long. One by one, Malik's pieces were snapped up by collectors who understood their true worth, not just in terms of money, but in terms of the cultural and historical statement they represented. The room was buzzing with energy, and Adrian, watching from the sidelines, realized too late that the game had changed. His plan to undermine Malik's collection was failing. As the auction went on, the prices for Malik's pieces soared higher and higher. By the end of the night, Malik had not only outbid Adrian, he had shattered the art world's expectations entirely. Malik Carter had claimed his place at the top of the art world, and no amount of scheming or backroom deals could change that. The power had shifted, and Adrian Marks had been left behind, a relic of an era that was rapidly fading. As the night drew to a close, Malik stood at the front of the room, his face a study in calm satisfaction. He had won. But he knew this was only the beginning. The storm he had started was only going to grow stronger, and there were still battles to fight, rules to break, and paradigms to shift. The art world was never going to be the same again. And Malik Carter had made sure of it. As Malik Carter stood amidst the victorious aftermath of the auction, the art world had undeniably changed. It was no longer controlled by old money, by wealthy collectors who viewed art simply as a commodity to be traded for prestige or profit. It was now a space where vision, authenticity, and raw emotion ruled. Malik had, with a calculated yet undeniable elegance, reshaped the market, not just by buying art, but by bringing artists, collectors, and patrons together in a collective act of rebellion. But even as the world applauded his achievements, the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. Back at the Golden Frame, Adrian Marks brooded over his defeat. It wasn't just the money lost, it was the humiliation of being publicly outclassed. Adrian had spent decades in the art world, building his reputation and influence, and for the first time, he realized that his position had been reduced to irrelevance. Despite his best efforts to undermine Malik, the artist's revolutionary approach had won the day. The auction had only confirmed what Adrian had been dreading: Malik was more than just an artist, he was the architect of a new era. But Adrian was not a man to accept defeat without trying once more. His pride and his need to reclaim his former position drove him to one last, desperate act. He had spent years cultivating relationships with some of the most powerful figures in the art world, and he wasn't about to let that go to waste. Though his reputation was damaged, he still held sway over a significant portion of the elite. Adrian had one card left to play. A month after the auction, the announcement came: the Golden Frame would host a historic, one-time-only exhibit showcasing the greatest art pieces ever created. It would be an exclusive event, by invitation only, featuring the most significant works from the world's top collectors. The exhibit was intended to be a grand spectacle, a culmination of Adrian's career, and his attempt to claw his way back to relevance. He believed that this would be his crowning achievement, a chance to remind the world who still held the reins of the art world. What Adrian didn't know was that Malik had already anticipated this move. Malik had been quietly gathering his own collection for months. However, this time, he wasn't simply buying art to make money. He was preparing for a different kind of battle. His collection was becoming more than just art, it was a manifesto. Each piece he acquired had a message, a theme, a reason for existing, beyond the aesthetics. The works weren't just objects of beauty or profit, they were expressions of his vision, his revolt against the commodification of art, against the corruption that had infected the gallery world for years. When Adrian's exhibit was announced, Malik wasn't angry, he was inspired. The audacity of Adrian to try to reclaim his status was infuriating, but it was also a challenge. This was it. The final confrontation. Malik reached out to his network of collectors, artists, and patrons. He didn't just want to compete with Adrian's exhibit, he wanted to overshadow it completely. So, he orchestrated a series of private, invitation-only viewings, each more exclusive than the last. These were not just exhibitions. They were events. Performances. They would be held in secret locations around the city, and Malik would use them as a platform to display the radical, political nature of his collection. It wasn't just art that Malik was showcasing, it was a direct challenge to the old way of doing things. He had secured pieces that would make even the wealthiest collectors reconsider their notions of value. Rare works from obscure artists, pieces that were considered unmarketable by the old standards, were now in Malik's hands. These works told stories of struggle, of rebellion, and of identity. They were raw and uncompromising, and their emotional power was undeniable. Malik knew that the world was ready for something new. The night of Adrian's grand exhibit arrived, and the art world buzzed with anticipation. The exhibit was lavish and meticulously curated, showcasing some of the most expensive and historically significant works. But as the crowds filtered in, there was an undercurrent of unease. The familiar faces of the elite were there, but their conversations were tinged with uncertainty. It felt like a world on the brink of collapse, a world that was losing its relevance in the face of a new, more dynamic force. As expected, Adrian put on a spectacular show. He had spared no expense, transforming the Golden Frame into an opulent palace of art, filled with lavish works that reflected his established taste and his connections. The media was there in force, the socialites were out in full regalia, and the auction house reps were eyeing their next big sale. But as the night wore on, something started to shift. There was an emptiness in the room, a hollowness to the celebrations. The art was beautiful, yes, but it lacked the raw energy that Malik's pieces had brought to the forefront. It felt like a relic of a fading era. And then came the real shock. Malik's secret show was revealed. A sudden press release leaked the information to the media, sending waves of shock through the art world. Malik's network of underground collectors and artists had opened the doors to a pop-up exhibition at a reclaimed warehouse in the heart of the city. The show was an invitation-only affair, but the word spread fast. The venue was filled with raw, unrefined art, pieces that shocked, pieces that challenged. It was nothing like the polished, curated art that Adrian was selling. It was a reflection of a changing world, and the energy in the room was electric. The crowd, young, diverse, and passionate, milled around the works, exchanging ideas, discussing the meaning behind the art. The atmosphere was charged with the promise of something new. As the media descended on both exhibits, the contrast could not have been clearer. The old guard, the wealthy elite, were flocking to Adrian's show, but the excitement, the true spirit of the art world, was at Malik's event. The buzz was undeniable. The press, in droves, began to write about the new wave in art, the fresh energy that Malik was bringing to the table. Adrian's exhibit, despite its wealth, began to feel stale, its glamour tinged with the sense that it was losing its place in the world. The final blow came when the auction houses that had once catered to Adrian began to make moves toward Malik's collection. Several high-profile collectors who had been loyal to Adrian's gallery were seen leaving Malik's event, their eyes wide with the realization of just how out of touch they had become. The art world was undergoing a seismic shift, and there was no turning back. Adrian, once the king of the industry, found himself out of touch with the pulse of the world. Malik had not only reshaped the art market, he had redefined what art meant, what it could do, and who had the power to control it. Adrian stood in his empty gallery the night after the event, the silence echoing louder than the praise he had once reveled in. His empire had crumbled, and Malik, the artist he had once dismissed, was now the force that would define the future. Malik's vision had won, and the art world would never be the same.